Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guests for today. Welcome, mentors, to Mentorships in Education. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I have had a goal these last few years to provide my listeners with a free resource to help guide you in your quest for direction in working with students who are struggling. And each guest that we have is unique. They are all volunteering freely, not only their time, but their expertise. And I want to thank them so much. As the years have gone by, I've had so many people who have offered to be a guest on the show. I very much appreciate it. And I hope to be able to live long enough to get everybody on. Today's guest is no exception. I want to talk a little bit about her, but first I want to introduce by saying, often we conflate a child to a diagnosis. We look at the characteristics of the diagnosis and we expect the child in question to resemble that summary. We forget that not only is each child within a diagnosis unique, but each child has strengths, a uniqueness that overflows the summary or the diagnosis. One of the things that interested me with our guest today is that she made me very much aware of this. And she's going to help us understand how her work with children who are often diagnosed with autism often have areas of expertise, areas, unique situations that are positive. And we have a tendency sometimes to overlook those things. It's a different perspective, one that we're not accustomed to hearing. And I was very much hooked on this and wanted to learn more. And that's why I got in touch with her. Dr. Shoshana Levin-Fox is a psychologist from Jerusalem in Israel. And she has had the honor to work with some very prominent people in a very well-known facility and has focused her work with children have been diagnosed with autism. I also want to mention that I've titled this podcast, The Islets of Normalcy. And this is something we're going to look at more because it's one of the qualities of her exploration into children with the Dr. Feuerstein that we're going to be talking about later that drew me in, hooked me. What are the islets of normalcy? What do those mean? How do they pertain to children with autism? And why do they give us hope, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Shoshana Levin-Fox. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with me today and for giving me so much time and being so patient over the holidays so that we're able to do this. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Judy, for this opportunity.
Dr. Fox is a Jerusalem-based child psychologist. She is a play therapist, an autism specialist, and the author of the Parent-Friendly and Autism Casebook for Parents and Practitioners, The Child Behind the Symptoms. Between 1992 and 2017, she worked at the renowned Feuerstein Institute in Jerusalem, where she was responsible for the dynamic assessment and treatment of children who had been diagnosed as autistic. She has shared her wealth of experience using play-based methods to assess and treat young autistic children at numerous worldwide conferences, in professional publications, and most recently in her book, An Autism Casework. Just tangentially, I will say that her journey to where she is now has taken her through Ohio, Boston, Vancouver, and Jerusalem.
Right. It's
So
been a long haul.
she's made the round.
Yes,
So,
I have.
so let me have you begin by giving us a little bit of background on your journey, and including that, please, your choice as a psychologist to focus on children with autism. What was your aha moment here?
Interesting question. Well, start with that, I guess. First of all, Judi, thank you so much for that introduction, but most of all for this opportunity to share with you and your listeners.
My pleasure.
Sort of autism kind of out of the box from a different perspective. I was always fascinated my entire career with the topic of autism. And years ago, I'm not sure it's okay to say this in public, but, you know, in my formative...
Go for it.
Go for it. Formative university years was reading Bettelheim. Well, you know, okay, so that's what was going on in those days.
Yes.
And actually learned a lot and was dismayed to hear what happened later and the kind of developments that happened later at that particular place. But I always had a career-long interest in autism, and it might maybe have to do with the fact that as a child I was kind of shy. Hard to believe it now, but you know, kind of shy. So I always connected pretty well with children who weren't speaking. But that interest in autism absolutely flourished when in 1992 I received a SSHRC postdoctorate fellowship. That's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'm from the States, but I was doing graduate studies for about 15 years, various degrees, and working and so on in Canada, and so qualified. And I received that SSHRC for a proposal I put through to work to do some research in autism. Now, I'm a clinician at heart. I'm not a researcher at heart. I like to learn from what the children teach me more than from the numbers.
That's interesting.
And yeah, very much so. So, Judi, when I got this SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship in 1992, I had applied to do research in autism at the Feuerstein Institute in Jerusalem. And that was just a life changer for me, because between 1992 and 2017, I was working at the Institute. And I started off doing research for 2 years, but I'm a clinician at heart. And in fact, I hadn't been there for 2 months when the professor Reuben Feuerstein was saying to me, "Where are you?" And I said, "Reuben, I'm supposed to be doing a research project." He said, "We need you with the children."
Oh, wow. How wonderful.
Yeah. That's the kind.
I'm sure you're glad to hear that, though.
That's where my heart always has been, Judi. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so very soon, my specialty there became reassessing children who had been diagnosed elsewhere using conventional means, symptomless DSM-4, DSM-5, and reassessing children who had been diagnosed as autistic in other places. And parents had heard that we worked from an out-of-the-box, unconventional way. We weren't at all working from a conventional psychology model. We were looking for the child behind the symptoms and so on. So I really focused on finding the child behind the symptoms. And so often I found that children who had been diagnosed elsewhere using conventional means, symptomless, more formal criteria, a lot had been missed. And many were misdiagnosed. So
Now
that's
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. You mentioned the
sure,
DSM-4 and the DSM-5. Some of our listeners
sure.
may not know what that is. I believe you're
Oh, sure.
referring to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Is that
Right.
is that correct? And there's two different editions, an older one and a more current one. Is that it?
Well, right. In other words, there actually have been 5 over the last,
Okay.
whatever,
Okay.
80 years or so.
Right.
So
I'm assuming
my
that was 4 and 5. Okay. Right.
my career sort of the heart of my career spanned the sort of the range, so to speak, of the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, and I found that a lot of children using those uh, materials had been misdiagnosed. And we never gave the diagnosis at the Feuerstein Institute, we never gave the diagnosis the
Oh,
power to determine who the child was and what they were capable of. So it was a very different kind of working environment.
absolutely. And um, I'm thinking I actually don't have any experience with this statistical manual, but I'm assuming that within it, things are pretty well defined. Is that correct? And from a checklist, or is that how you?
There are symptom checklists. In fact, unfortunately, not so well defined.
Oh,
Um, in particularly in this most recent edition for autism, the DSM-5 speaks about a range of symptoms. So you can have a range of social problems, you can have a range of social communication,
mm,
and so on. Once you get a range, I think clinically, you're in very, very troubled waters because you're going to lose your specificity of what is really autism. And I fear that that's gotten lost these days. I know that many people would disagree, but I worked from a model that put the diagnosis aside, look for the child's strengths, look for those islets of normalcy, which was one of Professor Feuerstein's most useful terms. And that's what we.
I'm going to have you talk about that as we get into the discussion a little bit. But I want to understand when you had a profile of a student, the modifiability, the profile of the student. What does that mean? Profile modifiability.
Modifiability. Okay.
Right. What does that mean? How it sounds very flexible to me. So I'm wondering how, when you were doing an evaluation at the Feuerstein Institute, how they were open to evaluating a child from a much wider perspective, I guess, more. And what you said to me was it wasn't just about the checklist and what they fit into, but also it had to do with things that they were doing that didn't fit into the checklist that we consider to
That's
be more normal behavior.
that's right. That's right. So, do you want me to give you an example? Would that
I
be
would love
possible?
examples. My listeners love examples.
Okay.
So, yes.
Okay. So let's take a little guy. I wrote about it in the book. Was 18 months old when he came in. Very, very young. Sitting on the carpet, looking lost. Lost. And yet I felt he was very present. I felt his presence. He had no speech. He wasn't babbling. He wasn't playing. So if I took, at the time it was the DSM-4, if I had I never used the DSM-4 or 5 because I found they didn't give me an access to the child's strengths and examples of how to um, modify the child. That's was most interesting and important for us. So I'm looking at this little boy, and of course his parents had already started some floor time with him, which was a brilliant move on their part. And if you just looked at him and looked at a symptom checklist or used some of the DSM criteria, Judi, you would say, okay, for sure, this child is autistic. He's not looking around. He's not curious. He's not playing. He's not interacting, and so on. Okay, I saw that, but I would say to all the parents, it's not enough to see what the child's problems are. You have to see what the child behind the child's problems. So after observing him for a while and talking to the parents who were very distraught about his situation, I said to them, with your permission, I'd like to take off his shoes and socks. Is that all right? So I sat down on the carpet and I said to him, I'll use a pseudonym,
Right.
as I call him in the book. I said, Sasha, I'm going to take off your shoes and I'm going to take off your shoes and socks. And that's what's happening right now. And mommy and daddy are right here with you. Of course, he's not responding, but I felt he was in there listening. And I just gently began to tickle his toes. And you might not think it's much, but he looked at me. Under the circumstances, that was an important islet of normalcy. I coached his parents, trying to give them some idea of how they could play with him at home, how important it was for them to talk to him. And of course, it's very difficult for a parent, and I understand this, to talk to a child who's not speaking. Talk to him. Don't ask him questions. Don't ask him, what's this? What's this? What's this? Tell him what's going on, and so on. That child, 3 years later, we did follow-ups. I couldn't see the children weekly. There were too many children. The demand was too great. See the children, say, once a month, once every 2 months even. Give the parents homework, what they could do, how they could play with their child, how they would talk with their child. And we began to see changes. 3 years later, he was a completely different child, with a strength-based focus. So that from that little tiny, just looking at me. Now, in most assessment situations, a professional would not, would disregard that. Sad to say, but I think most people working conventionally would say, yeah, okay, he looked at me, but look, he's 18 months old. Yeah, so what? He's not curious. He's not talking. He's not doing this. He's not doing this. Where we would take those little tiny, I'm going to use the term again, islets of normalcy, a favorite term of the professor. I can give you a few more samples of what those can be in other situations, and just focus our energy right there and say, wow, that is so important. That means he's in there, mom and dad. So there's someone to talk to. Just keep talking to that person behind the symptoms. Here's how you can play with him using sensory play and so on. And I hope that gives a little bit of a sense.
And I am going to ask you for some more examples, but Dr. Feuerstein used to say, as I understand, I will never give the chromosome the last word.
Right.
I love that. I love that. And also in your work, I'm going to just read one of the things you wrote, and people can look at it because we're going to include this in a tab. They can look at your introduction to your book.
Okay.
But you write that a diagnosis may obscure the latent energy and positive abilities within a child that could help symptoms that are considered intransient or innate to fade. Can you explain that a little bit, please? That is so powerful for me.
Judi, I saw it again and again over the 25 years that I worked at the Feuerstein
I think what you
Institute.
just gave us, that example you just gave us, is what reminded me of this quote.
Right. I saw it again and again. I saw that when we helped parents, first of all, identify the strengths of the child, those little teensy-weensy islets of normalcy, and when we gave them the tools of how to talk and how to play with the child, and not to give, that was part of what we were doing. We just saw amazing changes. And what you just read was just absolutely true. We would see symptoms fade away. Can I give you another example?
Please, I'd love to have another example. I'm sure our listeners would too.
Okay. I believe in the book I call this little boy Josh. And this was an incredible experience, aside from being very satisfying professionally. It was just very heartwarming experience. with this child. He came in at the age of 3 with, at the time they were using the diagnosis PDD, pervasive developmental disorder. In my estimation, a very unfortunate diagnosis, which told nothing, but was used sort of as wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know it really means autism, and it didn't have a whole lot of meaning. At any rate, he had received this PDD diagnosis elsewhere. Very, very anxious little boy. And the day before he came into my office at the Feuerstein Institute, he had been expelled from nursery school. Now, not many children get this honor of being expelled from nursery school.
I'm not laughing, but it's so sad.
It was very sad, and the parents were really shaken. Why? Because when he was stressed, sensorially, in other words, too much noise, too much action, he would undress. Well, he had become overwhelmed in nursery school and had undressed. And of course, at the end of the day, the teacher called the parents and said, "I'm really sorry, but we can't take him back." The next day, he was at the institute. He came in his mother's arms. I'm going to go into some detail here because I think that will help flesh it out. And he was in his mother, looking very, very fearful, very, very anxious. And he came into my room. I had some toys scattered around the floor and so on. And it didn't take long before, out of anxiety, he went to the door. He peeled off his shirt. Raced out the door, down the hall, undressing as he went. It was quite a drama. His mother, of course, raced after him, picked him up in her arms that he was undressing as he went, brought him back. Terrified little boy. Now, this boy had an autism diagnosis, but looking at it from a Feuerstein perspective, from a functional kind of perspective, I'm going, wait a second, this child is not cut off, because that's the real issue in the original autism, and I hold by that. This child is not cut off, because if you're anxious, you're aware of your environment. Right. And if you've come into a strange setting, you're reading the environment accurately. Oh. And if you don't know who the lady is behind the desk, and she could be a doctor, you have reason to fear. So there's a whole lot of cognitive and developmental processing going on there. So it was clear to me that this child was anxious. It was clear to me that he had a developmental delay. And it was equally clear to me that he was not cut off in an autistic sense. So I'd like to describe to you how those islets of normalcy lead to a breakthrough. Okay? I want to give your listeners a sense of how the whole thing sort of fits together. Islets of normalcy, profile of modifiability, terms that we lived by at the Institute. What does it really mean? So Mom brought him back. I asked their permission to lock the door. I asked their permission. I said, it'll probably make your son very anxious, even more anxious at first, but you're right here with him. And we'll go through that anxiety, and then he'll calm, because if we just let him take his anxiety into the halls and run scared, we haven't really helped him. They were fine. And in fact, he showed some signs of anxiety, but Mom and Dad were wonderful in calming him. And then he began to look around the room. Well, on the floor, so far he's a nonverbal child, completely overwhelmed by the situation. On the floor, I had the old Fisher-Price dollhouse, the one that sort of opens up in a half.
Oh, my gosh, I remember that. Yeah.
Remember that, right? That's wonderful. Yeah. And he sat down, and there were some plastic, furnishings for it. And he sat down and sort of looked through the window of the dollhouse. And I thought, having had some background in floor time, I got down on the floor, lay down on the carpet on the other side of the window, and peeked at him through the window. Nice eye contact. I could see that his anxiety was receding. He began to take some plastic chairs, put them around the table, and take some little tiny figures and seat them at the table. Now, that's real important islet of normalcy. That's symbolic play, and that's really exciting to see that. here's a child who understands person, chair, table.
Mhm.
He reads that, he's reading the environment. And all of a sudden, Judi, he whispered, birthday party.
Oh my gosh. I'd be jumping
Right.
up and down.
Right. And I very softly, because I knew his threshold for stimulation was very, very
Right.
low, I very softly said, right, it's a birthday party. But that little tiny islet of normalcy told me so much about what was in this child. Had I accepted the PDD diagnosis and said, well, I think you should send him off to a special such and such a setting, and that,
Right.
oh, what would have been missed? Then I must tell you, I must share with you what happened. I hope it won't be a spoiler for those who read for those who read the book. But it was just so exciting that it was just so incredible. I said to the parents, I said, look, this is not autism. And some of your listeners would say, well, how can you say it's not autism? You didn't tick off all those symptoms on the list, and you didn't. No, I didn't. I saw all this beauty inside this little scared little boy who was overwhelmed sensorially. I said to the mother, okay, he needs to be in a regular kindergarten, but you're going to have to hand pick it, but that won't be enough. She says, well, we actually have another place. I thought, that's wonderful. I said, but his anxiety is going to overwhelm him very soon, and he'll find himself out of that kindergarten too. I said, I'll do some interactive play with him. Let's try 6 sessions over the next 6 weeks.
Mhm.
So we did interactive play that was more like play therapy. That he would come in. I'll tell you the breakthrough. It was wonderful, and then I won't go on, and people will have to just sort of pick it up to get what happened. But basically,
this will be the trailer, right?
This is the trailer.
Okay.
This is the trailer, right? I love it.
Okay.
So he comes in the next week, looking scared in his mother's arms. With her permission, I locked the door again so he wouldn't take all that anxiety all over the place. We'll just contain it and support him through that. He was sort of freaked out for about 10 minutes. He sat in her lap across from me at the desk, and I had some animals, stuffed animals on the desk. He took one look at the animals, looked at me in the eye angrily, took one of these animals, threw it over his shoulder behind him. And I thought, wonderful. We have an opening. So I took one of the animals and I said, yeah, I don't want this crummy tiger. And I threw it over my shoulder. And then we had a dialogue going where he was throwing animals. I had all the animals that I had in my toy cupboard, I brought out. And we spent like 40 minutes throwing animals all over the room. I saw him for 6 times. After 3 sessions, he already had improved behavior in the kindergarten. Over the years, this child went on to be completely normal, and I presume now he's married with kids. He went to university, the whole business. He was fine. And it all started with seeing that little islet of normalcy and realizing that against the symptoms, this was the symptoms then, no, that's not the place to look. This little boy, he's in there. The child behind the symptoms is in there. And sure enough, he was. His parents did.
So, I mean, it's so disheartening when a child is misdiagnosed, that diagnosis then becomes the parameter of what we expect from the child, how to work with the child. And it's so confining. And I guess I was going to ask you what some of the implications are of a misdiagnosis, but you've kind of given 2 very good examples about the consequences of a misdiagnosis and how a parent or even another mentor, a teacher, a psychologist as yourself, can change the trajectory of a child's life
completely
by using these terms that are so confining. So
It- you're
restricting.
you're so right about the confining, and I think it's reached a stage these days where once people get a diagnosis of autism or spectrum, I'm talking about children now. My
Right.
bailiwick is young children. Once the children get a diagnosis, whether they are genuinely autistic or not, people then look for the aspects of the child's behavior that justify the diagnosis
Right.
rather than looking, as we did, for the anti-symptom. So may I just return to a question you asked before about
Yes. Yes.
what's a profile of modifiability?
Hmm.
I think the example that I just gave you of Josh, of getting down on the floor, looking through the window, and getting eye contact from him is a tiny, tiny example of what we mean by profile of modifiability. In other words, what did I do in a session that helped create change in the child? Well, I guess in that case, it was understanding that the child was fully present and relating to him. I know you're in there. I know you're scared. And yes, it's a birthday party. What did I do? What did the clinician do to create change? What changes were observed in the child? Well, what changes were observed in Josh? In that second session, when I did some uh, tossing animals around the room with him, basically the change that was observed was the child who had been freaked out for half an hour the first session was only freaked out for 10 minutes, and in fact made a nice warm, if nonverbal contact with the clinician. So that's evidence of change. So that's part of the profile of modifiability.
Absolutely. And I hope it helps me understand a little bit. I know that you don't want to have a big discussion on play as a form of therapy because we have other things that we need to go into. But I just want to understand, you did make a couple of comments, and I just want you to
Mhm.
explain them because your examples are very indicative of the comments that you made. So you said to me that play is a two-way street, and you have talked about proactive play.
Right.
And so, why is play
Mm.
such an important tool for observing children during an evaluation process and not just using a checklist?
Oh gosh, because play really is like a mirror. Play is like a mirror of many, many aspects of child development: speech, language, communication, personality, emotional tone, cognitive, mental understanding of the world, fine motor, gross motor. Everything a child is can be, why do I say it's two directional? Observed through play, can't be measured, but it can be understood. In other words, if you're into measurement, play probably won't help too much. But if you're into understanding, play gives you a mirror into the child. But more than that, play, whether it's through play therapy or as I used at the Institute, DIR floor time, developed by Doctors Serena Weider and Stanley Greenspan. It's developmental play. So you're starting at baby level play, tickles and cooing and rocking and holding, gentle holding, and so on. And then you're moving up to turn taking, and then you're moving up to adding vocalization and words to it. And then you're working into meaning and some, you just go up the developmental ladder. Play also gives the clinician the way to influence the child's development in all the problematic
Yeah,
realms, in all of them.
I like that.
I mean, if you think about it, I think some of the best speech therapists that I've ever encountered are those who know that how to unlock the power of play. They get the child playing. Others will sit at the child and sort of do exercises. But the best ones will start to play with the child, and then the child starts to vocalize, and then you can use that to improve things. But,
When I was trying to decide what the title for this
mm,
podcast was, I was also wrestling with another term that you used. And I think you've given us plenty of examples of that. You said create a bonfire from the sparks.
Oh, yeah.
And I was thinking about using that also as a title for the podcast. So what you're saying is that these little islets of normalcy, and correct me if I'm wrong, are kind of like the sparks. And
absolutely.
And you're developing them into a bonfire and working with the kids and making them making them these little things you're noticing become the primary and the most important focus, rather than some of this checklist stuff that we have a tendency to focus on.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Judi. That's islets of, I sort of mix the metaphors. On one hand, you got islets of normalcy, which conjures up a vision of Hawaii in the middle of the
right.
Right. And then you've got these sparks that I sometimes refer to. It's the same kind of thing, same idea.
I'm sure they have bonfires on the beach in Florida.
I'm sure they do too. I'm sure they do.
I also want to spend some time talking about your book. And we've gone over some of it. We talk about the child behind the symptoms. I think we've kind of talked about that a little bit. But I'd like to understand, with all of the collective information that you've put together, many people collect a lot of information over the years, but they don't sit and write a book. What was your impetus to actually sit and get this? What need did you see that you thought the book would help to mitigate?
No, very important question. I think overall, Judi, I just saw too many children that were being hurt by this overenthusiastic use, overgenerous use of misdiagnosis of autism. In other words, even when a child is genuinely autistic, there's still much that can be done. But I saw so many children whose futures and whose developmental trajectories were headed for an unhappy place that didn't need to be. I'm not saying that every child that walked into my office was going to turn out 100% fabulously normal, but I could see the potential in the child, and my colleagues also. We could see the potential, because that was the watchword of the Institute, was actualizing potential in these children. I saw too many children over the years that were hurt, and I also saw too many parents that were discouraged, really had lost a lot of hope about what could be done for their child.
Oh my gosh.
And I wanted to share these stories of success. Not all of them are flaming extraordinary successes, and that was important to put out there too, that not all of them end up with the happiest endings. But so many of the children that my colleagues and I saw ended up in a so much better developmental place than they had been when they walked into our offices, for starters, that I realized that this had to be shared. And I also wanted to share the whole perspective. One more word about it. It was in a lot of books about all kinds of things. You start off with the theory, and then you put the case studies that exemplify the theory. It was really important for me to start off the other way. I really wanted the children's stories to tell about what is possible. I wanted the children's stories to show parents that the diagnosis of autism does not have to have the power to determine the child's future. It does not have to. It may have the aspects of autism may, but to give the diagnosis, especially at an early age when there's so much misdiagnosis going on, I just had to share it. So I put the kids first. I put the children's stories first. I talk very, very frankly about the amount of energy and support that I poured into parents to help them see their child through my eyes. I mean, it might sound rather egocentric, but it's not. I wanted them, I saw parents that were devastated by the conventional diagnostic process, and they would come in and some of them weeping, and come into my office for the first time, and I'd say, wait a second, we don't work. I said, I see some of your child's difficulties, but that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning. I see that. But I want to see more. I want to see where your child can get to. It was just really important for me to share that experience. And then in the latter half of the book, still has another 6 case studies in it, woven through the theory to help people get a handle. And it's not written in a really thick academic kind of a thing, So I believe it's accessible.
Parents could read it and get some insight. And you
I hope so. Yes, I think so.
And you also talk about if they are looking for a practitioner. If they're looking for a practitioner, some of the things you mentioned in the book may help them in finding someone who is more positive in working with their child rather than more confining in working with their child. So do you feel that it's important to have an early diagnosis or an early evaluation? Or, okay, I kind of thought no, but I want, because we need to do this soon.
I think what needs, it's an interesting question. I think what's important is early intervention rather than early diagnosis. I make a distinction because almost all the little kids that I saw and that I talk about in the book, most of them are youngish. They had been diagnosed at an early age. The diagnosis in most of the cases proved absolutely mistaken. Some of them had various other developmental issues that had been obscured by the autism diagnosis. So I'm very much in favor of, I think it's critical to get early intervention. The diagnosis of autism, however, sometimes is just given so prematurely and is then given so much power to determine who the child is and what they're going to be and how much they're capable of. Whereas if you I work from the, primarily I use the DIR floor time along with Feuerstein inspiration, we could get so much change from these children. I will go back to that example I gave of little 18-month-old Sasha sitting on the floor. Interesting case in point to what you're saying about diagnosis, early diagnosis, as opposed to, and what I'm saying about early intervention. They were very worried. They were intelligent people. And of course, uppermost in their mind, maybe our little boy is autistic. Interestingly, they decided, and I think it was a brilliant decision, not to go for a diagnosis, but to take their little guy to the best DIR speech therapist in Israel. And they got to her doorstep.
And what does DIR stand for? What is it?
Okay, it's DIR floor time is a play-based method of intervention developed by Drs. Serena Wieder and the late Dr. Stanley Greenspan. Mm-hmm. And it refers to it's developmental, it's individual. Okay. In other words, the play is individually adapted to a child's, particularly their sensory needs and the way, and above all, it's relationship based. And the floor time basically means you're on the floor playing with the kid. You're not behind your desk with a symptom checklist going tick, tick, tick. You're getting involved, you're getting engaged, and you're going for that kid behind the symptom. But case in point, just to go back to little Sasha, interestingly, at the age of 2.5, 3, his parents decided not to go for the diagnosis, but to focus all their efforts on the best intervention they could get for him. And it paid off remarkably. It just paid off remarkably in his case. So I think he never did get the diagnosis of autism, but his parents, he just went from strength to strength. It was remarkable to see.
So it was an early intervention, but there's also an
Absolutely.
understanding that comes along with that. It's an
Absolutely.
early understanding of what the child
Needs
to have
needs.
done rather than
Now,
what they
now,
can do.
now another point here that's kind of political, Judi, is the fact that I can almost hear some of your listeners who aren't yet listening as we record this, but I could almost hear some of your listeners say, yeah, but you can't get the intervention unless you've got the diagnosis. And I think I'm aware of that fact.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't live in a cave. I'm aware of those dynamics, particularly in the States. We can't get the services for a child unless we have the diagnosis. And unless he has an autism diagnosis, then we can't get the services. Okay, so you're in a loop, and it's almost like the system itself is creating a
Against you.
situation. Well, yes, in a sense, because you might know in your heart as a mother, I don't really think my kid is like really autistic, but I think he really does need some speech therapy.
Right.
The only way I can get the speech therapy and the OT and the this and the that is if we get this autism diagnosis. So very sad, and very sadly, uh, a lot of times the whole politics of the system contributes to this diagnosis as opposed to potential focused way of working.
So sometimes the parents may need to have the diagnosis, but then, as you say, bear in mind that it is a process they need to go through, and then they can focus on the support, the understanding, the intervention that they need to have.
Absolutely. May I just add that,
Yes.
parents would come in. Obviously, we have the same dynamic here in Israel. The National Insurance Service pays parents, of autistic children. They get a certain amount, which they can then use for the child's therapies. So parents would come in and they've already had the autism diagnosis. And I would say to them, here's what I see your child's problems, but you know what? I see this kind of strength and this kind of strength and this islet of normalcy and this islet of normalcy and this kind of strength and this kind of strength. I said, you know what? Don't worry. I'm not going to phone the National Insurance Institute and say, you know what? Little Joey here is not really autistic. It's like, you need that money for speech therapy. I'm here to tell you your child is not really autistic. He has a developmental delay that's rooted in this, that, or the other. And I would contribute whatever I was learning about the child to fill in the blanks. So, yes, that's right. In other words, you can, it's going to sound a bit crude, but I don't forget me some of the legal trouble here. Take the money and run, but hold on to your belief in your child. Hold on to your knowledge of your child. The diagnosis does not have the power to determine your child's future. Your child's strengths and potential are what can help, let's say, outweigh over time the symptomatic kind of behaviors. You mentioned a while back, you sort of made reference about finding good practitioners. And I think it's so important to find practitioners who see the strengths of your child. So if you're sitting down, in a first meeting and say, well, practitioner says, your child has an autism diagnosis from such and such a major hospital. Yes, I see. Well, I'll be working with him in such and such a way. In other words, if they don't see the potential of the child, keep shopping if you possibly can. Get people who work with your child who believe and who see the potential of your child. Very, very important.
Those are some wonderful, wonderful tips. And I think that if parents don't get and mentors don't get anything else out of this, I think the last two things that you've said are probably the most important ideas that we need to keep in mind in working with our children. Before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to throw out there that might be supportive of the topic that we're discussing or helping?
Right, how to bring out the best in your child.
Right.
Yeah, one is two things, I think. One is being aware that the in my estimation and from my experience, uh, the autism diagnosis is being used very, very liberally. So I think it's important for parents to be aware of that. We've gotten very, very far from the original configuration of autism 80 years ago. And some people say, oh, that's wonderful. That's a great thing. I don't think it's serving many, many children well. And it's putting children in a big kind of under a big umbrella that's way too big. And we're missing both children's strengths and often we're missing underlying difficulties. So that's one point. And the other point from a practical point of view is it's so important, and I learned this from Professor Feuerstein, it's so important to talk to your nonverbal child.
Oh, right.
Now, it's so important. Now, he had some research to back it up, but I'll talk a bit about what that can do. I've just seen that make so much difference. Most parents, when a child is not talking, obviously they're very saddened, they're very worried, they're very discouraged, they're very depressed, they're going through a lot of really difficult stuff. So in a way, it's natural not to talk to your child the way you talk to your other children. So I would tell parents, don't quiz them. A lot of times parents say, what's this? What's this? What's this? Just hoping to hear, pencil, red, purple, water. I'm not diminishing that I can understand why a parent would be just craving to hear that. But the importance of just talking out loud to your child as you're doing stuff with your child and as you're doing stuff alone. Sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? But it's not. So it might sound like, well, as the kid is, let's say, on the floor lining up all his little cars in a row, perfect angles and so on. And you kneel down and you give him a kiss and you say, well, you know what, sweetie, just like you would with any of your other children. We're out of milk and we're out of cottage cheese. I'm just going to go to the store right now. And Daddy's here and he's going to watch you. Bye. See you soon. Or while Mom's in the kitchen puttering around, I think I'm going to make us pancakes for breakfast this morning. Instead of standing there silently, vocalize, mom and dad, vocalize, talk about what's going on in the world without demanding from the child. It's not instead of speech therapy and all that other stuff. It's a talk aloud method that really makes a difference. When you're taking the kid out of the bathtub or putting him in, oh, the water's so hot, isn't it? Oh, I'm going to put some cold water in. That creates in the child a propensity, an interest in the language channel. Does it make miracles overnight? No, but I have heard parents come back to me, and there is a chapter, one of the case studies in the book. I won't spoil that one. Where a very, very depressed mother, she talked openly about her depression since her child had been diagnosed as autistic. And I talked with her about how important it is to talk to her child. I said, if your little boy came in the office and said to me, my mommy stopped talking to me and I don't know what I did wrong. So pretend that's happening, Mom, and just talk. And I gave her some examples as I gave to you right now. And 3 weeks later, I got a call from her and she was so discouraged. I fully expected her to be calling to cancel the appointment. And she said, you know what? I started just sort of talking to him, even though he's not looking at me or saying anything. He seems to be. But you know what? I think he's looking at me more. And he started babbling, and he's never babbled before. So, and then, of course, I could coach the parents up the developmental ladder. All these little things are just so important. But talk to your child. Not only for your child, for yourself, moms and dads, talk about what you're going through. Like, oof, I wish Daddy came home early tonight. How come Daddy's spending so much time at the office? It's good for mom to express that to the child, and children pick up that they're being talked to, it can make a difference.
And I just throw in there that when I'm working with some younger parents, one of the issues that I have is that when they take their child out for a walk in the carriage, they have their cell phone in front of them. When they take their
Ouch.
child into the supermarket, the child's sitting in the carriage and the cell phone is in front of them.
Ouch.
When they're in the car driving and the child is in the car seat, they're on Bluetooth. And
no.
I explode. I say, please put that phone away when you're walking through the supermarket. And this would hold with your examples also. Talk about, we need to get some pancake mix because we're going to have pancake tomorrow morning. I don't see the pancake mix. Let me see where it is.
Excellent.
Oh, there it is over there. And we talk about that. And this cell phone thing has become a major bugaboo to conversation with parents and kids. So I just wanted to throw it out there and tag it on.
True. Very true. I'm with you on that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Shoshana Levin-Fox. I so much appreciate all your time and your patience. And we did have some challenges that we seem to navigate. I want to thank
technology.
Yes, well, technology and also the holidays. We kind of been waiting for a little while. So I appreciate your patience and sticking with me for this. I want to thank our listeners also.
Thank you, Judi.
Thank you for being with us today. I know that Dr. Fox would love to hear from you. If you get in touch with her, if you have any questions, I'm sure that she would be willing to give you some communication and direction if you needed that from her.
Absolutely.
Please stay tuned. We have some wonderful guests coming up over the next few months as we continue to find what is going on in the world and try and provide you with a free resource so that you can educate yourselves as to what is out there and what you might be able to use to help your child. Thank you so much. Be safe and stay connected. Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and mentorship and education podcast so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week and thank you.